Thank you very much. Thank you and welcome. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa, and welcome to Threshold of Hope, where we take a look at the various writings of the church. And we are still going through St. John Paul II's encyclical known as Veritatis Splendor, which means splendor of truth. Now you can get a paperback copy if you go to EWTN's religious catalog. If you go online, it's EWTNRC.com, or you can call 1-800-854-6316 to order a paperback copy of it. Or if you prefer, you can get a free electronic copy of Veritatis Splendor by going to our regular website, EWTN.com, and at the top you'll see libraries. Click to Document Library, and then type in Veritatis Splendor, and it'll come up. You can download it into your computer for free, but you got to print it out on your own. That's your dime. Now, of course, we want you to be involved and participate in our program. You can do like all these nice folks have done. We've got a big group of folks who've come all the way from Lake Charles, Louisiana, and a few folks from other scattered parts of the country. And you can come here as well. We love having you in the audience. Or you can send a question by email by writing to threshold@EWTN.com. Or you can call during our live broadcast. And that is, the phone number is 1-800-221-9460. That is if you are in the United States or in North America. If you are not in North America, then you can call 205-271-2980. That also applies if you're right here in Birmingham. It's a local number. All right. Oh, by the way, the country code is 1. Now, we are still in paragraph 36. We left off there last week. And we were talking about how some forms of modern philosophy emphasize autonomy. That, that this is, some of the philosophies say that human beings determine what is right and wrong all on their own. And they are autonomous from any other influence. Nobody else can tell them, I decide what's right for me and what's wrong for me. Of course, that inevitably ends up deciding what's right for you too. Even though if everybody's autonomous, you see where the problems start to come in. That my decision about what's right for me gets imposed on you. And then we have to come up with a way to deal with it. And the Pope, we began paragraph 32 saying that this has also had a big impact in Catholic moral theology, especially over the last 50 years, 60 years, even a little bit closer to that. So we have to acknowledge that underlying this attempt to rethink everything about what is right and wrong, about moral theology, there are certain positive concerns, and some of those positive concerns are part of the best elements of Catholic thought. You see, Vatican II gave a certain encouragement about this because it has a desire to foster dialogue with the modern culture and therefore emphasize what is rational. In other words, see, a lot of modern culture wants to use reason by itself. This is key. I've mentioned this in our last encyclical, Faith and Reason, and it's coming up here too. That's why I've done these two encyclicals back to back. Faith and Reason gives us a background. And here's the issue we have to keep in mind. If you use reason alone, You're going to run into certain difficulties. And here's why. Reason is a tool. It's a great tool. I love reason. And it's a tool that gets you from point A to point B in a straight line of logical steps. That's good. That's why I compare it to a ladder. A ladder gets you from one point to another point in steps, following a straight line. Unless you bought a broken ladder. But apart from that, a normal ladder takes you from point A to point B. But here's where you always have to keep something in mind. That the ladder is only useful depending on where you put it in the first place. What is the ladder based on? If you put a ladder up against a blank wall, you are going to run into a blank wall. So it depends on where you start. If you put it under a window, then you have a chance to go up to the window and get in. But if you put it up against a blank wall, it gets you to a blank wall. See, and that's why people miss that a lot. They think, well, we're just going to be reason. It sounds very noble. But they don't ask, where did you put the starting point of your thinking? That is what's key. Because then that'll determine where you end up. But again, the Vatican Council wants to see that there are good things about the rational, of course, because other people are rational. And then we have a dialogue with people. That's one of the good things. We can talk to people outside the faith if we use reason. That's good. And that's why Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 40, says, presupposing everything which has been said by the council concerning the mystery of the church. So the council has not said that everything is rational. It talks about the church as a mystery and the rest of the mysteries of our faith. But, it goes on, the council went on, we must now consider the same church, inasmuch as she exists in the world, living and acting with the world. So we have to engage people in the world and get into a dialogue with them and use rational thought as a way to carry this on. And that we can have a universally understandable and communicable character of moral norms. We want moral norms everybody can understand. So use reason. You want one that everybody can communicate. You can explain it to anybody. You use reasonable thought to dialogue with the rest of the world. And that's a good thing. And a lot of the moral norms belong to the sphere of natural moral law. So that we see St. Thomas Aquinas wrote in the Summa Theologica, the Prima Secundi, question 71, answer 6. A human act is evil through lacking conformity with its due measure. And conformity of measure is a thing which depends on a rule, from which, if that thing depart from the rule, it is incommensurate. Now, there are two rules of the human will. One is proximate and homogeneous, namely the human reason. So the human reason helps you understand what's going on. And the other is the eternal law, the first rule, which is God's reason. So in other words, let's unpack what he said there. Natural law, what is that? This is the law God put inside every human nature. Its most basic form is what's known as the silver rule. Don't do to other people what you don't want them to do to you. That's the most basic statement of the moral law, natural law you can find. So, anybody here in this audience, how many of you would like other people to steal your stuff? All right, nobody, okay. How many of you would like a stranger to come up and start punching you in the face? How many of you would like a stranger to come up and shoot you? Nobody, still nobody. Well, then the logical conclusion for the natural law is don't do it to anybody else either. If you don't want them to do it to you, don't do it to them. And anybody can think, that's what it means by the proximate force, that your reason, your own mind can figure that out. Anybody can figure out, I don't like getting punched around. I don't like getting robbed. Anybody can, and therefore you can use your mind to figure, therefore I should not rob other people because I can assume they also do not want to get robbed. Okay? And then you also add to that God's law. That's what St. Thomas was saying. God's law also adds that I, the Lord, say, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery, and you shall keep holy the Sabbath, and you shall honor your parents. So God's law adds something more positive, and then when you get to Christ, you see even more positive. That, you heard in the old law, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I say don't get revenge. So this is, God's law goes beyond natural law. But natural law is a good place to start. And everybody in the world can start off with natural law. As a matter of fact, when you see various movies in which the bad guys are about to try and kill somebody, the victim always says, don't kill me. Now, why are they doing it? They assume that even the bad guys know the natural law. I didn't do anything to you. I don't deserve to be killed. Everybody knows that. If you are caught by cannibals, you can still appeal to the natural law and say, I didn't do anything to you that you'd have a right to eat me. You can make that appeal on any level. That's where you use thought and reason. And then you can take it to the new circumstances. For instance, if you don't do that to an individual, then you can apply that, say, to international relations. Just because you have more cannons, tanks, and guns than we do, that does not give you a right to steal our country. That's a base. So it's not only for the individual, even on bigger scales, you can do that. Now, while everybody agrees with that, there are some points where some people don't want to agree with it. For instance, how many think that they would like to have their arms and legs cut off? Presumably nobody, right? Then the logic of natural law, it's not Catholic revelation, but natural law. Therefore, you don't do it to an innocent baby in the womb. Very simple. And, well, what about in the case of rape? Well, would you cut off the arms and legs of the rapist? Of course not. You can't. That's against our constitution that forbids in the Bill of Rights cruel and unusual punishment. Well, if you don't do it to the perpetrator of the crime, then you don't have the right to do it to the baby who is a victim of that man. This is what I mean by using reason. You think through the issues. And this is something that we should be able to do as human beings. Now, there has also been an attempt to reaffirm the interior character of ethical requirements that derive from natural law. So in other words, some people obey the law merely because they're afraid to get caught. That is what we mean by external pressure. Internal understanding of right and wrong means I don't do it because I know it's inherently wrong. Now, most of us go through different stages in our development as moral people. When we're small children, you can't say to a 2-year-old, really, you ought to have a very high image of your baby sister and share with your sister or your brother. Or, you shouldn't take your sister's dolls and pull the heads off because they got exploded by G.I. Joe. Not that I would know anything about that. No, they didn't have G.I. Joe in my day. So there. Too old for G.I. Joe. But you can say, if you mess with your sister's toys, mommy will give you a spanking. If you break your brother's stuff, then mommy will spank you. And that you say, oh, okay, that I get. Until you're older, then you can understand, no, their property is something that belongs to them, and I respect their property from inside. That's the interior. So we can do it by exterior. I don't speed because I don't want to get a ticket, or I don't speed because I want to follow the rules of the road and stay safe on the road. See, that's what he's talking about there. And this is a good thing to have the interior character. The better approach is to have right and wrong come from inside your own conscience, rather than just fearing the police or whatever other person. And that when you have that, then you have an obligation in your will, not just a fear of punishment. Fear of punishment is a start for most of us. But maturity leads to having an interior understanding that my will is obligated to do what is right and wrong, avoid wrong and do what is right. And it's an obligation acknowledged by human reason and by personal conscience. So that's all positive stuff. However, here's where the problem comes in, including with Catholic theologians. Remember, he's still talking about Catholic theologians. The problem is some people disregard the dependence of human reason on God's wisdom. I do what I think is best, not what God thinks. As a matter of fact, God's opinion does not come into play for me. It's what I want to do. And I don't even take into any consideration what God asks of me or demands. And they also disregard the present state of human beings having a fallen human nature. Human beings are not all saints. In fact, not many are. And when you listen to what the saints actually say about themselves, they'll talk about themselves as being pretty bad. They're because not out of false humility, but they're more sensitive to the bad they do than the bad people are. Really bad people never think that they're doing anything wrong. That's a good indication about how bad they are. That they will always, and as a matter of fact, talk to anybody who works in a prison. Not many people in there are guilty of anything. They're all innocent. Ask them. Whereas they're all framed, all of them. Whereas one of the things that you have with really good people is they're sensitive to the badness. Well, that's part of having a fallen nature. And because we have a fallen nature, we need God's revelation all the more to remind us of what is right and wrong. Sometimes I don't take the time to think, well, I don't really like getting robbed, so I guess I shouldn't rob anybody else. Sometimes it's just very convenient for me to remember, thou shalt not steal because I said so. That's sometimes very helpful. And it may not, again, be the best, but it's an important part. And that we need God's revelation as an effective means to know what is morally true and what is false and what is evil. To know even about things in the natural order, like marriage. We live in a society that disregards marriage quite a bit. And as a matter of fact, I just heard in the news that there's one of the football players out in Seattle had said to his fiancée that he and she are going to prepare for marriage the way Jesus wants them to. And that they are going to remain chaste until marriage. And what happens? The people in the gossip press are all mad at him. You should be over that. They are angry that he is following Christian morality. Though I guarantee you, if he were to be doing immorality, then they would be talking about that, going, ooh, we know what you're doing. They would manipulate that. But now they're just mad. It's Russell Wilson, who's the quarterback of the Seattle Seahawks. And, you know, he's trying to live a Christian righteousness. And they hate it. They are angry at him for doing that. What does that tell you about them? What it tells me, as someone who's heard a lot of confessions over the last 39 years of being a priest, is that they are guilty and they don't like it, that someone is avoiding what I suspect are sins they may be committing or have committed. Just a suspicion. I don't know these people, but I know people. So, we see here that some people disregard that human reason needs help from God in His revelation. And some Catholic theologians have posited complete sovereignty of reason in the domain of moral norms. Only what they can understand by their reason alone. This was something strongly introduced in the 1960s especially. Why? Because the union, it's called the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, were going after the Catholic schools and telling them, you cannot use church teaching as a basis for your academic career. Your universities should not use Catholicism. And they were attacking the Catholic universities and going after the professors based on a statement that the AAUP had come up with in 1915 and again in 1940. And then in the 60s, as the sexual revolution took place, and as unionization was an option, they made a strong move on Catholic universities and the professors. They wanted just pure reason and research and not God's will and God's revelation for deciding moral norms. Such norms would constitute the boundaries for a merely human morality. That's all they want, just what is basic human, not what God wants. Because, again, a lot of these folks, they don't believe that God will judge your souls. They take the part where Jesus, our Lord, said in Luke 6, judge not lest you be judged, and gave that commandment to us that we can't judge souls, and then they assume God can't either. Surprise, surprise, Sergeant. It's not going to go that way for you. And they want to have a law in which man, in an autonomous way, lays down for himself what is right and wrong, and only human reason comes up with it. And interestingly enough, what you can find in the social sciences, in no way could God be considered the author of the moral law for these people. He has nothing to do with the moral law, except in the sense that human reason exercises its autonomy in setting down laws by virtue of a total mandate given to man by God. These trends of thought have led to a denial in opposition to the scriptures and to the church's constant teaching that the natural moral law is given by God. These people don't want us to believe that the natural law was put inside our conscience by God. And this is something that our Lord Jesus said in Matthew 15, beginning in verse 3, when he asked the people, why do you transgress the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? For God, and then he goes on and gives some examples of that. But the idea is that when you go against the moral law, you are transcending the law of God. And that's what they want us to deny. And that man, just by use of his reason, participates in eternal law. But we believe the eternal law is not something that we establish, but God does. Now, here's one of the things I'm going to give you a little clue on to what's going on in culture. Because on one hand, they began by saying, this is just about human reason. But today, they don't want you to think about these moral issues. They want you to emote. So what is the issue going on with now the Supreme Court making a decision about same-sex marriage? What was Justice Kennedy thinking? He said so. Well, I feel sorry for kids who are being raised by a same-sex couple, and people might feel bad about them, or will make them feel bad about themselves because they don't have a mommy, or on the other hand, they don't have a dad, depending on who raises them. You don't base law on what somebody else might say and somebody else might feel in response to it. It's basing law on emotion. And then even the president, what did he respond? He said, love wins. This isn't about the feeling of love. This is about legislation by a branch of our government who does not have the constitutional authority to pass legislation. And when the people did vote and legislation was used, 32 out of 34 times, the people voted against it. Because they're also looking at something that marriage is not about love winning. As a matter of fact, and we should make it clear, we are not against love at all. Never should we be against love. That's ridiculous. But saying that something is what it cannot be, and making marriage primarily about adults and what they feel at a particular time, rather than the commitment of adults who in their complementarity as man and woman then make it possible for them to have children, versus a law that establishes a type of institution that is not marriage, but can have children in one of two ways: adopting children that are not their own, or one or other member of the relationship commits, quote, adultery against that relationship in order to have their own biological child with somebody who is not and cannot be biologically their partner. That is what they're trying to do. And they're using emotion terms, painting the White House in colored lights to look like a triumphal flag, where they don't even do red, white, and blue on Independence Day at a time when people, I just watched them on the news last night, they didn't know who was the general that led us in our freedom against the British Empire. They didn't even know from which country we got our independence. And one lady in her, I assume, 50s, said, well, was the original Independence Day in 1946, 47? And they're trying to get other colored flags when our own flag is not understood? Because they're using emotion. They say they start off with reason, but they abandon reason. And then the other thing that they will do is attack anybody who disagrees with them with great anger. Oh, how can you say these things? You are a hater. Not that I am correct or incorrect. I made a mistake in logic. But they use an emotional argument that I'm a hater because I disagree with them. They are incapable of using reason and try to manipulate with emotion. This is where it inevitably goes when you start down this path. And the Pope didn't live long enough to see where some of this would go, but we do. And that's why we have to learn to think and reason on the basis of our human reason and natural law given by God in our conscience, and on the basis of revelation. And then use reason on that basis so that we don't put the ladder of our reason into the quicksand of emotions that are manipulatable, change constantly, and lead to something oftentimes worse than a dead blank wall. It leads to a quicksand that swallows us whole. So we're going to take a break. We'll come back in a couple minutes. We're going to get your questions and your comments, so please stay with us. Thank you. Again, I want to invite all of you to come here and join us, as I did earlier in the program. You can contact our pilgrimage department. They'll give you all kinds of information about scheduling of masses, programs, places to stay, good places to eat. Now, don't have to tell Louisiana people about eating. They know about that. They got that down pat. But they'll give you all sorts of that information, plus instructions on how to get up to Hanceville. You can contact our pilgrimage department by calling them at 205-271-2966. Or you can go to EWTN.com and get that kind of information. Well, let's start off with a question. We have Joan on the line. Hello, Joan. Joan, are you there?
This is Jean.
Oh, Jean. Well, then they told
Father
me
Mitch.
they changed the vowel in your name.
That's okay.
Jean, where are you from?
I'm from Long Island, New York.
Long Island, New York. Great to have you. And what's your question?
Well, Father, I was fortunate to find a couple of nice old pamphlets on secularism in church, and they were written for something called the Discussion Club. And different orders would write these pamphlets, I guess, for discussion, like the Jesuits and the Redemptorists. And after reading through a little bit, I was wondering, why hasn't Catholic moral philosophy been able to squelch secularism?
Yeah. You know, there are a number of reasons. Jean, I would recommend, just to get a sense, take a look or think back in your memory of the way Catholicism was portrayed in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. We're always, Going My Way, Bells of St. Mary's, Song of Bernadette. These were, Academy Award-winning movies. The church was portrayed very well. And then we see, beginning in the 1960s, matter of fact, I don't know where you can even get this anymore, or if you can, but there was a video done called Hollywood's War on Catholicism. And it was, in fact, one of the hosts was Michael Medved, who himself is Jewish. But he recognized that we were the targets of Hollywood. And if they go after us, of course, Jewish people would also be struck. And he noticed how it began as mockery and treating the church as silly, and then it got more and more negative. So that you then get to things as evil as Angels and Demons by Michael Brown or Dan Brown, and so on. And in addition to that, you also had a lack of understanding by a lot of the leadership in the church in the 60s. They were accustomed, they themselves as bishops, were told, you do this, you go ahead and do it. And they began to come across a generation that were called from the 1950s through the 60s the new breed. That you had to prove to them why they should obey you, as opposed to just obeying. And so that was a change theologians made, and that this showed up in the universities. Thirdly, you also have there was a theory that started in the late 50s and came into prominence about 1968 and later. Namely, that Catholic children are incapable of an act of faith, therefore don't teach them faith and morals, teach them about a loving community, and then when they're older they'll have questions and then they'll answer. So that some of you might be young enough to have gone through the days in which you did collages for your catechism class and did not study the faith, didn't memorize anymore. Memorization of the faith was out. Memorizing the 10 Commandments, the sacraments, precepts of the church, and so on. All that was gone. And you have a lot of folks who don't know what Catholicism teaches. And when I taught at the university, I saw this with my students. When I would require them on a quiz in the first quarter, I say, write out the 10 Commandments. Hardly any of them could. They might get a couple. But they were surprised at what the 10 Commandments included. Especially when it said, I didn't know that was a sin. Can I see you later? And then I'd make them write it out again on the midterm exam. Write them out. And then again on the final exam. Because even after the first time they didn't know it, the second one didn't know it, third time they they might know more of them, might even get it to 8 out of 10. This is the state that we have in the church. And so if you don't have those basics, how are you going to have Catholic moral philosophy develop? If you don't know the 10 Commandments as the first steps of the ladder of reason, then you don't know where else to go. So a lot of people make their decisions on the basis of their conscience, by which they mean, well, this is how I feel about it. How many times do people ask me, well, how do you feel about this, that, or the other issue? To which I respond, my feelings are irrelevant. I don't care how I feel about it. There's some, depending on the day, some sins I feel pretty good about. Doing them, that is. But that doesn't make them right. It is, what do you know and think and choose about sin, not how you feel about it. If I really want to have a certain thing, I may feel really good about just going ahead and taking it, but that would still be wrong. So, and that shift towards identifying conscience by how you feel instead of how you think, and divorcing conscience from the thinking process, that is cultural. And not enough Catholics stood up again. They didn't realize it was going on until it was too late. So now we got to do a little catch up. We've caught up to things before. We can do it again. We have a question from our studio audience. Ma'am, where are you from?
Lake Charles, Louisiana.
Good to have you here. I love Lake Charles, Louisiana. It's a good place. And what is your question?
Well, it's more of a comment.
Okay.
The other day, a Catholic said to me, at work, we had a situation where a coworker said to me, now how do you feel about same-sex marriage, that the Supreme Court has ruled on it? And he said, the only problem I have is that it wasn't put to a vote. If all the American people voted for it, I wouldn't have a problem with it.
Well, here's that. See, that's problematic on two levels. First of all, it's just what I was saying. How do you feel about it? That's irrelevant. Why are my feelings one way or the other of any purpose? And if there's a vote, that doesn't change my feelings. It expresses the will of the population, but not my feelings. And we have to be careful about votes. Again, as I mentioned earlier in the show, when people at the beach on Independence Day thought that General Patton led the Revolutionary Army against the British. General Patton! I mean, these people don't know much. And ask them, how many believe that freedom of religion is in the Bill of Rights? I fear that too many people will say separation of church and state is in the Bill of Rights when it is not. It is not there. It is nowhere in our Constitution. And people don't know that. So we have to be careful even with votes. Hitler won election as the Reichskanzler in Germany. Does that make it right because the people voted for him? No. Now, of course, he took away the freedom. They didn't get to decide on the other issues like, persecuting the Jews and such. But, even with, and in many places in this country, I don't know the whole history of voting on it, but it was well accepted that Jim Crow laws preventing people of color from voting was legal. That did not make it right. It was still an evil decision. So we can't even go just by votes. We have to analyze, and as voters, we must examine what it is that is on the ballots we vote for and choose what is morally good on the basis of principle and not, well, it might hurt somebody's feelings. Well, that doesn't matter. That's irrelevant. The issue is it morally principled? And we don't hear that much. We have an email here from Frank in Brooklyn. Father Mitch, I've been discussing the sacrament of reconciliation with some Catholic, Muslim, and Protestant friends. They have denounced this sacrament, even my Catholic friend, as nonsense. Sounds like a Catholic who hasn't been there in a while. Would be my suspicion. They claim that you should not confess your sins to a priest, but that you should confess your sins to God and God alone. I've told them that this practice of confession was instituted by Christ himself on Easter Sunday night. And he gave the power to forgive sins to his beloved disciples, again, on Easter Sunday. There was some challenge to this by my Muslim friend, as he doesn't believe that Jesus is both God and man. Matter of fact, your Muslim friend does not believe, he may not believe, if he believes in the Quran, he may not believe that Jesus was crucified, died, was buried, or rose from the dead. In the Quran, they deny that Jesus was crucified. Now, they don't say what happened to him, but later Muslim theologians have said that another guy called the Shabih, the lookalike, was crucified. Some even say that it was Judas Iscariot that looked like Jesus, and he was crucified in his place. And so your Muslim friend does not believe, not only does he not believe in Jesus' divinity as well as humanity, he doesn't believe in the crucifixion or the resurrection, while every Christian, to be a Christian, must believe in the saving death of Jesus and his resurrection. So it's difficult to get through to him, well, a lot of issues. Though one of the things I remember being asked by a Muslim who said to me in Jerusalem, he was from Hamas, but the religious branch, not the political. And he said, Abuna, I'm very much sorry, but Jesus, he did not die on the cross. So I said to him, who knows you better than anybody in the world? Didn't answer. So I said, it's your mother. Nobody knows you like your mother knows you. She bore you, she fed you, she nursed you, clothed you, everything. Nobody knows a man like his mother. And my problem is that the Lady Mary says she saw Jesus die. Now, keep in mind, in the Quran, Mary is without sin, so she could not be lying. That would be forbidden for any Muslim to believe that she could tell a lie. They believe that she's without sin. Only Jesus and Our Lady and the whole Quran are without sin. So he couldn't say that she was lying. So he said, but Abuna, maybe Jesus, he's all covered up, or the Shabih is all covered up, and she thinks it is Jesus, is another man. I said, no, this is the problem. They took away all the clothes she had made for him. And my problem is this: do I believe the Lady Mary, who says that she saw Jesus die on the cross, or Muhammad, who 600 years later says he did not? And that's my problem. I digress. So my question to you is this: can you help me prove to them that confession is not some nonsensical practice, that it is instituted practiced by Jesus, instituted by Jesus? Can you also help me show them the power of the priesthood and likewise the ability for a priest to forgive sins? Frank from Brooklyn. Well, Frank, a couple things. First of all, we see that the argument that you only confess to God and not to man is found in the Bible. That is there. It's the argument that the Pharisees use against Jesus when he forgives the sins of the paralytic man that was being lowered through the roof in Mark chapter 2. So if you're talking to a fellow Christian, I would say, well, if you want to stick with the arguments that the Pharisees used against Jesus, you have to make that choice. I, on the other hand, am going to use the teaching of Jesus Christ, who claimed to have that authority, and then who claimed on Easter Sunday night to breathe on the apostles the Holy Spirit and said, as the Father sent me, so I send you. Whoever sins you forgive, they are forgiven. Whoever sins you retain, they are retained. So if your friend wants to go with the Pharisee argument, he'll explain that to Jesus, I'm sure. If you want to go with the argument of Jesus Christ, then it's time to become a Catholic. Or for the Catholic who's been away from confession, get in there himself. Okay. All right, we have another question from our studio audience. Ma'am, where are you from?
I'm St. Joan of Arc from Oberlin, Louisiana.
Good to have you here. Welcome. And your question?
Because of the Supreme Court's ruling on same-sex marriage, how do you suspect we'll see effects from that in the United States and upon the Roman Catholic Church?
There are going to be a couple things. For the most part, male homosexuals will not marry. They're not interested. In a study by Weinberg, and I forget his associate, 71% of men with same-sex attraction admit to having 500 or more lovers. Only 29% have fewer than 500. And of that 71%, 27% admitted to having 1,000 or more. So that marriage is not going to affect that part of the population. It will have more of an effect among lesbians. They will enter into more marriages, or as they call them, unions. But the men, no, very few will, and they won't. And the average length of a monogamous relationship between two men is 2.5 years. So another effect it'll have is with the divorce courts. But then what will happen is when same-sex couples try to do things in various ways, you'll see, first of all, that they've already been suing various private companies to force to serve at their weddings and stuff. Secondly, they are going to go to the universities and sue the Christian universities to force them to have same-sex couples in the married housing sections. It's going to be the next area of law. And then they will try in various ways. They say, no. This won't affect anything that you do in the churches. However, already, military officers who are Protestant chaplains are losing their commissions in the military because they will not do same-sex marriages. Now, they will try the Catholics. If they can break us, then it's over. And already we've seen the Episcopalians and the Presbyterian USA, and of course, the President's denomination, United Church of Christ, they have all gone for it. And others will too, because that was the law of the land. Whereas, as Catholics, we say, I can't follow the law of the land on abortion. I should never have followed the law of the land when it came to segregation. And the church taught against the law of the land and the Constitution on slavery. And we will do the same in this issue and stand up against culture. So, and that may have an effect on us later on. They'll try to remove our tax-exempt status and thereby confiscate church buildings. That's going to be the end game, and remove us from any role. So we might be having mass at your homes. Another effect will be on the few children who are raised by same-sex couples. The studies on those children have shown that it's been a very, very negative influence on them. It's not been good because they miss having a parent of the opposite gender to give them both sides of things. All right, well, we've run out of time, and the Lord bless you and keep you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And again, we can bring you these programs and all the other shows that we have here on EWTN only because of you. You make it possible. So please remember to keep us in between your gas bill, your electric bill, and your cable bill, especially these summer months, because our bill collectors don't take vacation. Thank you.